Our speaker this evening studied archaeology at the University of Southampton and then stayed for uh, his postgraduate career doing a PhD. Um, then decided that academia was probably not the right course of developing his future life. I don't think it pays enough, to be quite honest with you. Um, but he just couldn't get away from digging. So he decided to join the National Coal Board, where he received training, which I think is a bit like being in the military. It's second to none in terms of the way that they develop their personnel. But then, where most of his career or later career in the National Coal Board seemed to be working with shipping and importing of coal, that got him an entree into shipbrokering, which has been his career ever since. He's also written one book, details of which I've published in that handout, and is well on his way to writing his second, with ideas of his third. I don't know where these people find the time. I'm not going to say any more. I am just going to introduce to you our speaker this evening, Robin Thomas, and I'm going to leave the stage and over to you, Robin.
Okay, thank you very much for your introduction, Dudley. So I'm going to talk to you today about the Commissariat Department attached to the Duke of York's headquarters in the Flanders campaign 1793 to 1795. Now, in 2022, Helion published my book. That is the front cover of it, and it was a study of the administrative structure of a British expeditionary force in the late 18th century. And in there is a chapter on the Commissariat. Now, since the book was published, I've done a bit of further work on the Commissariat, and this is the what I'm going to share with you today. So I'm going to start off with a few operational details about the campaign, just to refresh everyone's memory about what actually went on. And this serves to set the scene for what the situation the Commissariat had to deal with during 1793 and 1794. But I'm going to spend most of the talk discussing the procurement of the three major commodities that were the responsibility of the Commissariat, namely food, forage, and most importantly, cash. I'm then going to have a look at developments in 1794 before rounding up the talk. Now, let's have a look first of all at some operational background. The French declared war on Austria in April of 1792, and they invaded the Austrian Netherlands. Austrian Netherlands, think modern-day Belgium. They were pushed back almost immediately, and this was followed up by a Prussian invasion of France, which ended up at the Battle of Valmy, as you can see marked at the bottom of the map. This triggered a second French invasion of the Austrian Netherlands, which resulted in the Austrians being defeated at Jemappes. You can see there to the left of the big blue arrow. The French then proceeded further north and ended up on the border of the United Provinces. The United Provinces, think modern day the Netherlands. They managed to take the fortresses of Breda, Klundert, and Getreidenberg, and they laid siege to Willemstad and Maastricht, which are the two blue dots towards the top center of the map. Now, this triggered an Austrian response in the form of an army led by Prince Coburg that crossed the Rhine, as you can see in the top right of the map, and he defeated the French at three battles there marked by the red dots near the center of the map, at which point the French retreated for the second time back to their national borders. Now, while this was going on, the French had declared war on Britain and the United Provinces on the 1st of February of 1793. And so the British government sent an expeditionary force to assist the Dutch in the defence of the United Provinces. And the commander chosen was the King George III's second son, the Duke of York. And the British troops start landing at Helvoetsluis in the first week of March. So the French have retreated back to their national borders, as you can see here. And that was a very, very heavily defended area, a double fortress barrier. And in fact, the first 15 months of the campaign consisted of the Allied Combined Army, Austrian-led under Prince Coburg, battering its way against various fortresses in either the first or second line there. So a period of very static warfare. Now, there are a few issues that arose from this situation that affected the Commissariat. First of all, this area, the Austrian Netherlands and the French border, had been fought over by several armies for 8 to 9 months before the Duke of York's expeditionary force ever turned up. So a lot of the commodities that would be useful to sustain an army had already been accounted for by these armies. Secondly, and perhaps less apparently to the casual observer, the British force had been tasked with helping the Dutch to defend the United Provinces, and it had been envisaged in London by the government there that transportation around the theatre of operations would be performed by water because of the extensive canal network and river systems. And it was envisaged the troops would land, they would acquire river craft and therefore be able to move themselves around. However, almost at the same point as the British land at Helvoetsluis, they suddenly find that theatre of operations is not the United Provinces, it is the French border. So there's then a mad scramble to try and acquire transportation assets to move everybody, all the men and the equipment and the stores south at the same time as the Dutch are trying to do the same thing. So there are major transportation issues at the very beginning of this campaign. So that, I hope, sets the scene a little at the beginning for when the Commissariat showed up about 2 weeks after the troops. This was not the fault of the Commissariat or indeed the Duke of York. That was how things had been organised by the British government. And the Commissariat Department was led by this gentleman, Brooke Watson. He was born in 1735. He was orphaned at the age of 6 and went to live with a relative in Boston, Massachusetts. That relative, unfortunately, was subsequently declared bankrupt, and he then went to live with another guardian up in Nova Scotia. He obviously had a commercial turn of mind, and he started his working life as a commissary during the 7 Years' War in North America, and most notably under Major General James Wolfe in Quebec in 1758. Now, the year after that, he moved to London and set himself up as a merchant trading to North America. In fact, he was the last British commissary general in North America at the end of the American War, 1782-83. Back in London, he was elected as a member of Parliament in 1784. He chaired the Select Committee on the Regency. He was also active in what became the Lloyd's insurance market. He was a member of the first committee of Lloyd's in 1772. And he was also active in the Corporation of London, being elected an alderman in 1784, sheriff in 1785-6, and then after this campaign ended, he became Lord Mayor of London in 1796-1797. Now, the observant amongst you will notice that he is missing his right leg, and this came about in his earlier career when he had been attached to the Royal Navy, and for one reason or another he was swimming in Havana Bay and had his leg bitten off by a shark, as portrayed in this picture, quite a well-known picture by John Singleton Copley, now hanging in the National Gallery of Art in Washington. So that is the basic structure of the Commissariat Department. Obviously, there were assistant commissaries and deputy commissaries. I've gone into a lot more detail about the personnel in the relevant chapter in my book, so I'm not going to repeat that here. But I think it's important, as part of setting the scene, to just discuss what the Commissariat responsibilities were, and equally importantly, what they were not. So I mentioned at the beginning 3 primary responsibilities for food, forage, and cash. Food, we're basically talking about the soldiers' bread ration of 1.5 pounds of bread per day, or the materials to make it. In other words, flour, wheat meal, or rye meal. Now, one interesting cultural issue that the Commissariat had to face during this campaign was the German auxiliary troops in British pay. We're talking about the Hanoverians, troops from Hesse-Kassel, Hesse-Darmstadt, and a battalion from Baden did not eat bread made with wheat meal. Only the British troops would eat that. They would eat rye bread. And so the Commissariat had to cope with these cultural differences. But forage, in terms of quantity, far outstripped what was supplied to the personnel, and that consisted of oats and hay, and then cash, obviously. Now, the Commissariat was also responsible for the acquisition of transportation assets. So we're talking here about horses, wagons, and rivercraft, which I'll come on to later in the talk. During winter quarters, at the end of 1793, the Commissariat was also responsible for sourcing fuel. So that would be wood and coal for the use of the troops in barracks. On the other side of the chart, you can see what they were not responsible for, and that included small arms, artillery, ammunition, greatcoats, and camp equipment, all of which was supplied by the Board of Ordnance. And at this period, the Board of Ordnance is not part of the army. It's a Department of State headed by the Master General, who was a cabinet minister. Uniforms were provided by proprietary colonels. Meat was contracted for by individual regiments. General orders from the Duke of York's headquarters in April of 1793 ordered commanding officers to contract with a suitable party for the provision of meat. And this continued the precedent set, I think, in the 7 Years' War, when they did the same thing. Medical supplies were provided by the Army Medical Board based in London, and regimental surgeons were given an allowance to buy medicines and so forth. So those items were not part of Commissariat responsibilities. During the campaign, these distinctions became slightly blurred, and the Commissariat Department was regarded very much as a kind of purchasing organization. And so they had to get involved with things like sourcing entrenching tools for when the army was undertaking sieges or making field works, for example. They also had to find ships to accommodate 3,000 French prisoners, and then more supplies for winter quarters, which included blankets and rugs for the use of the troops. So this hopefully sets the scene where their responsibilities lay. So I'm now going to talk about the first of the 3 major items that the Commissariat had responsibility for, and that is the procurement of cash. Because without cash, you cannot buy food and forage, pay the army, pay allowances due to the army, such as bat and forage money, and it is the foundation of everything the Commissariat did. Now, cash was procured through the use of bills of exchange. So if you cast your mind back to the checks that we all used to use before the days of bank transfer, the bill of exchange was a signed, unconditional written order binding one party to pay a fixed sum of money to another party on demand or at a predetermined date. Now, there are up to 4 parties involved with bills of exchange. So we have Brooke Watson, who would be the person wishing to deliver the money to a supplier. He would then send the bills of exchange to a mercantile house who was responsible for converting that into cash. Then there would be the party actually paying the cash, and ultimately that was the British Treasury in London. And finally, there is the recipient of the cash, who would be a supplier of goods or services based in the Low Countries somewhere. Now, I've been through about 2,800 of these bills of exchange, and all of them that I've seen were payable at 30 days sight. And this seems to have been standard British Treasury terms as far as I can see. So on the map here are the places that Brooke Watson visited after reporting his presence to the Duke of York. He then went on a tour to line up the mercantile houses that he needed to supply him with the cash and with the commodities to sustain the army. So in Amsterdam, he saw a firm called Melville and Wolff. In Rotterdam, Crawford and Company. Antwerp was Verbroek and Company. In Ghent, Jean-Baptiste de Luce, who became a very major supplier. And in Ostend, George Keith and Company. Now, all of these suppliers earned their money on the basis of commission. So typically, they would charge 1% commission on negotiating treasury bills and 2% commission on procuring supplies paid for by treasury bills or obtaining ready money. So what was the money that all this that these payments were made with? And here we have the currencies at the top for the United Netherlands and the bottom for the Austrian Netherlands. The base currency in the United Provinces at this time was this stiver, and all of the coinage represented multiples of different numbers of stivers. So in the contracts for goods and services, they're generally expressed in terms of guilders, and as far as the exchange rate with the pound was concerned, 11 guilders to £1 was set in general orders on the 29th of July 1794. In the Austrian Netherlands, there were 2 currencies. Firstly, there was the French currency, louis d'or. 1 louis d'or was set in general orders as equivalent to £1 sterling, and that consisted of 4 French crowns, so each crown 5 shillings. However, this is an Austrian province, and so Austrian currency was also used there, and contracts were also expressed in sols. 7 sols made up 1 shilling, 20 sols, 1 florin. So contracts are expressed in terms of florins and sols. Now, British troops were paid in louis d'or and French crowns from about August of 1793. That's the first mention I found. Brooke Watson had been ordered in late April 1794, so nearly a year later, to pay the troops in gold. And the general orders explain this is because the expense, inconvenience and danger of transporting silver. Now, the only explanation I can think for this is the volume of silver coinage to equal the same amount of gold was somewhat larger and therefore more bulky and possibly more difficult to transport. So I want to now look at the exchange rates that Brooke Watson was having to manage. As you can see, the brown line at the top is the exchange rate from pence to the guilder, the blue line at the bottom from pence sterling to the florin. The gap in the guilder line is simply because in September of 1793, no bills of exchange were written in guilders or to procure guilders. Now, 74% of the produce from treasury bills during this period in 1793 was used to buy florins and 26% to buy guilders. This is not so surprising, given the fact that the army spent most of that period in the Austrian Netherlands, where florins were the currency. But one thing to note from this chart is the blue line at the bottom, which shows a depreciation of pound sterling against the florin, really starting in about August of 1793. And this caused the Treasury some concern. So in order to mitigate this, Brooke Watson requested the Treasury to send him £100,000 of currency in louis d'or, Dutch ducats and French silver. This would have meant he could pay ready currency instead of negotiating bills of exchange in a market which is rapidly going against him. Unfortunately for him and the British Treasury, they didn't have this quantity of currency in London to send him. So the next thing he could do and did do was to start using the Dutch currency markets, where the exchange was much more favourable. And as you can see from the brown line, it's relatively stable up there, in contrast to the blue line at the bottom. Now, all of these arrangements actually worked out pretty well from the British side, because Brooke Watson and his counterparts, the mercantile houses, managed to gain on the exchange the sum of just under £70,000 in 1793 money. This is the exchange, the rate he was able to obtain above par. And as we can see from these lines here, it shows the fluctuations of the guilder and the florin above par during the 1793 campaign. So I think what we gained from this is that Brooke Watson had to be very mindful of how currency markets operated in the theatre of operations. This included the differentials between different exchanges. So guilders, for example, as you can see from the chart, traded at between about 6.5% to 9.5% above par throughout the year. The produce from bills of exchange converted into florins, on the other hand, deteriorated from roughly 12.5% above par down to 7.5% above par during the year. And that's a reduction of approximately 40%. Now, unfortunately, these currency movements came during the latter half of the year, when Brooke Watson's expenses were going up because there were additional troops joining the army, not only from Britain, but also units of German auxiliaries. So his costs are going up and the exchange rate is going against him. The other thing he had to be aware of was the differential between silver currency and gold currency. So, for example, in November 1793, he wrote back to the Treasury saying that the cost of obtaining silver was nearly 1% cheaper in the Austrian Netherlands, but gold was between 0.5% to 1.5% cheaper in Amsterdam. Now, he needed gold at that particular point, so he opted to buy gold in Amsterdam as opposed to silver in the Austrian Netherlands. He also was watching the overall exchange rates in these exchanges. So when it moved in his favor, he was then stocking up on cash in advance. A case in point, at the beginning of February of 1794, he bought an additional £30,000 worth of cash because the exchange rate had moved in his favor. So he was taking a position in the market, very, very similar to what a trader would do today. So let's have a look now at the payments made by Treasury bill during this period. What I've done here is to analyze all of the Treasury bills for the first campaign and put them into the chart to quantify the quantities of money that he was handling. As you can see, in May, there is a slight spike in payments. This was due to stocking of magazines at the beginning of the 1793 campaign. There's a general increase in expenditure due to, as I said before, due to troop buildup, and also at the back end of the year, obviously purchasing newly harvested crops. the very marked increase, particularly in December, was because Brooke Watson went back to London for consultations with the Treasury on Boxing Day of 1793, and he was the authorised signatory for bills of exchange. So he wrote enough to cover January of 1794. If we continued this chart into 1794, there's a big zero against the month of January, and this is why. He also had to stock additional magazines that were set up for the troops in winter quarters, which accounts for some of this increase in October, November. And he was paying £1,000 a week for pioneers at the siege of Dunkirk in the late summer of 1793. And then finally, there was a payment of £10,000 scheduled for the back end of the year for bat and forage money. Generally, this was paid at 6 monthly intervals. And just to remind those of you who are not so familiar with bat and forage money, troop and company commanders, so captains in other words, were responsible for purchasing a horse called a bat horse, which was used for carrying things like camp equipment, the kettles that the men used to do their cooking, and tentage, things like this. So obviously those horses had to be purchased and they had to be fed. Another thing, well, if you look at the overall spending for the campaign, 1793 campaign, this comes to £707,000 in total. And just to give some idea of what that would mean in today's money, I used the Bank of England inflation calculator, and in September 2024 money, that comes to £86.1 million was expended by him during 1793. However, the next year, in April 1794, Brooke Watson is writing back to the Treasury, estimating that he will require £200,000 per month. Again, in September 2024 money, this comes in at just over £22.3 million per month. Now, I have data up until about the first week of July 1794. Most of the payments are over £120,000 in 1793 money per month. This is before the Lord Moira's troops arrived to augment the Duke of York's army, and that took place in July. So I can believe that £200,000 a month with those additional forces would have been reasonable for him. He estimated all of this to subsist 60,000 men and 35,000 horses. So fairly chunky payments are required to do this. Now let's turn to look in some more detail about food and forage and how that was procured. But firstly, to quantify the sort of quantities that we are talking about, this slide is derived from some calculations made in December of 1793 by a chap called Alexander Davison, who was Lord Moira's Commissary General. Lord Moira's force was put together with the original intention of assisting the royalists in Western France, but that didn't happen. Essentially, they were too late, and it was subsequently withdrawn back to Britain and then went to assist the Duke of York and was amalgamated with his army in the Low Countries. So I think what this shows is the ration, standard ration, 1.5 pounds of bread for each man, and the horses 10 pounds of oats and hay each. In fact, looking through the Duke of York's general orders, heavy horses for things like the heavy dragoons and baggage horses tended to get a slightly larger ration of 12 pounds each of oats and hay per day. But this gives a general idea of the sort of quantities required to subsist a force of 20,000 men and 4,500 horses. All of that comes to, in imperial tons, 1,800 imperial tons for a month. And don't forget also the transportation resources required to shift this quantity of material around the theatre of operations, fairly sizable numbers of wagons, drivers and horses required just to move it from here to there. So where was this all taken? At the beginning of the campaign, the Hanoverians, if we start at the very top, they are marching in to join the Duke of York's force. They cross the Rhine, and 2 magazines at Emmerich and Nijmegen are set up to supply them, and both of those are shut in at the end of May 1793. The British at the same time are marching down the squiggly line from the top of the chart down to Tournai, a rather circuitous route, but they were supplied from Bergen-op-Zoom, Bruges and Ostend in between March and April of 1793. And then from April onwards, they had a forward magazine at Tournai and a rear magazine at Ghent. Now, one thing to note from the positioning of these magazines, they are all located on rivers. So at the top, the 2 blue dots, Emmerich and Nijmegen, are on the rivers Vaal and Rhine. Ghent and Tournai are on the river Scheldt. Bruges is on the Bruges-Ostend Canal, and Antwerp and Ostend obviously are seaports. And obviously having the magazines on waterways assisted greatly, not only the original provisioning, but also movement of commodities around the theatre of operations. Now, during winter quarters, at the end of 1793, beginning of 1794, additional magazines were set up, and no prizes for guessing where the British contingent was located at this period in West Flanders. The Dutch would have been to the south and east, and the Austrians to the south and east of them. So the additional magazines set up at this period were at Newport, Dixmude, Kortrijk, Ypres, Oudenaarde, again connected by waterways. Newport and Dixmude on the river Yser, Kortrijk on the river Lys, Ypres on the canal system, and Oudenaarde on the river Scheldt. So I want now to have a look in more detail about how food and forage was actually acquired. And I will run through each of these in turn. Firstly, there were supplies sent from Britain, and this was due for a number of reasons, one of which was local shortages. Got to remember the factor of seasonality, which is not something that often crops up in studies, operational studies, military history. But the troops have landed, or start to land, beginning of March in the year. So the harvest for 1792 has been and gone, and the harvest for 1793 has probably not been sown yet. So obtaining the wherewithal to subsist the men and horses is not so straightforward at this time of the year. So as a result, Brooke Watson obtained via the British Treasury, the Commissariat is a division of the Treasury, I should say, so that is his reporting line back to London, and he asked the Treasury for supplies. They ship between late May and late June 1,100 tons of oats and 1,000 tons of hay. What the Treasury is actually doing is to contact the Royal Navy's Victualling Board, and they are the buying agency, and they also arrange the transportation of these commodities over to the Low Countries. Brooke Watson also needed at different points during the campaign some emergency supplies, and so in September of 1793 the Treasury sent over 200 tons of ship's biscuit, 4,000 bags, 100 weight per bag. This was to provide 5 days supply for the entire army, that is the entire army in the Duke of York's under his command, the British and the German auxiliaries, not the Dutch and the Austrians. There was also another reason why the British Treasury was accessed for commodities, and that could be because whatever it was cheaper or easier to obtain in Britain than it was in the Low Countries. So, for example, October, November of 1793, the Treasury shipped over considerable quantities of coal and candles for use by the troops during winter quarters. And again, in February of 1794, the Duke of York ordered Newport to be supplied with salt provisions for 2,000 men for 1 month. So Brooke Watson asked the Treasury to send over 32,000 pounds of salted pork, 400 bushels of peas, 2,700 gallons of rum, and 1,000 gallons of vinegar. So again, the Royal Navy Victualling Board was asked to provide these things. Some small volume of supplies also came from the Austrians. Only one occasion I can trace when this happened, which was late May to beginning of June 1793, when essentially the Duke of York's command marched into the Austrian sphere of operations in order to undertake the siege of Valenciennes. Now, this wasn't very ideal, to be frank, from a commissariat point of view, because the Austrian magazines did not always have sufficient supplies. And there was one occasion when the Hanoverians turned up and went away empty-handed with no bread, which caused some degree of bad feelings. So Brooke Watson wrote back to the Treasury on this occasion rather touchingly, and I quote, saying, "My feelings on these occasions are not to be described, for hunger cannot be satisfied by reasonings." Most of the bread, particularly during the latter part of the campaign, came from the Hanoverian Field Bakery. And this was a unit of the Hanoverian army that was sent from Hanover down to join the Duke of York's contingent. It initially consisted of 6 ovens and supplied the Hanoverians only. It increased to 10 ovens for 30,000 men. And by July 1794, it was based in Antwerp and it was supplying 40,000 men. This was quite a major unit. It had its own commissary, bakers, tradesmen, transportation, and even a padre attached to it. But most of the supplies that the army consumed during 1793 and 1794 came from contracts with suppliers made by Brooke Watson, and including supplies that fed the Hanoverian Field Bakery. So much as we would get today, these contracts were either for the commodity only, or for transportation only, or for commodity plus transportation. And in fact, that was the majority of them. So I want to give you 3 examples of the type of contracts that were made. The first example was for multiple suppliers supplying to a single destination with the commodities provided in bulk. So this concerned a magazine at Ostend that was set up for the Hanoverian troops in April 1793. Crawford and Company supplied the rye meal, Melville and Wolfe supplied 1,200 tons of oats, and the British Treasury supplied flour and hay. A second example at the same time, April 1793, concerned the main magazine at Tournai, which was for a single supplier to a single destination. But on this occasion, the supplies are shipped to the magazine in already designated rations or portions, in other words, part of a ration, not in bulk. And this contract was made with Mr. S.F. Sayes of Bruges for a term of 1 month, commencing on the 16th of April, 1793. And you can see here what he was contracted to provide. Payment here is in currency of the Austrian Netherlands. And that represents a slight variation on the first contract I showed you. The third one was a bit later in the year for the magazine at Ghent in October 1793. And here we have a single supplier providing commodities to a single destination. And these are partly delivered in rations, ready designated rations, and partly in bulk. So this contract was made with a merchant called Pierre Martens, who had his mercantile house in Ghent, and the contract was designed to support 35,000 men and 20,000 horses for 30 days. The hay was delivered in £10 bundles and the straw in £12 bundles. So the oats and the wheat meal would have been in bulk. Now you can see there the value of the contract, £42,400 in 1793 money. Again, if we use the Bank of England inflation calculator, that comes to just over £5.1 million in September 2024 money. So the Commissariat Department had a number of issues that it had to solve, and I'm going to give two brief examples of these. The first concerned lack of transport, and I mentioned that at the beginning of this talk. The 11th, 15th and 16th Light Dragoons landed at Ostend in late April of 1793, and because of the lack of forage at this time, remember the seasonality issue, the men were sent with 8 weeks provisions and the horses with 6 weeks of hay, oats and bran. So the volume of all of this came to just under £5 million. A lot of the, I know I keep talking in pounds, that is the unit of weight that is expressed in most of the correspondence for this campaign. So £5 million, roughly speaking, 5,000 wagon loads on the basis of £1,000 weight per wagon. Now the problem here is the Dutch are also trying to obtain rivercraft, and because the armies, the Allied armies, are moving south from the United Provinces to the French border, and everyone is scrambling for transportation resources. Shipment by waterway is an awful lot cheaper than shipment by land, but Brooke Watson had no choice. He could not get enough river craft to do that movement. So he ended up having to go by road, and that meant signing a contract with Jean-Baptiste de Luce, a merchant of Ghent, for 60 wagons of 4 horses each, and this was designed to deliver £240,000 weight per day from Ostend down to the magazine at Tournai. The contract was worth just under £2,500 in money of 1793, just under £301,000 today. Now, the problem here was that the contract failed, and it failed pretty quickly. And reading between the lines, I think Jean-Baptiste de Luce had miscalculated the cycle times that it would take his wagon teams to travel between Ostend and Tournai and back again. So the contract was scrapped, and Brooke Watson had to make another contract also with the same supplier. And this time it was for 100 wagons of 4 horses each. And of course, as in the nature of these things, the price had gone up. It was now £6,300, equivalent to about £772,000 in September 2024 money. And it had a term of 3 months. So what was the net result of this? The cavalry finally joined the army on the 14th of May, having been delayed on their journey by about 2 weeks while all this transportation issue was resolved. By late May of 1793, Brooke Watson had 70 wagons and 40 carts owned by the Crown, and then 100 wagons under contract from Jean-Baptiste de Luce. Now, the second example of a commissariat issue that I want to give you concerned the Hanoverian contingent, which started arriving in April of 1793. It came in 2 divisions, and by division I do not mean a military formation, because such did not exist in the 18th century. I mean an agglomeration of all arms in 2 groupings, if you like. The first division, all of the first division, and half of the first division and all of the second division had to be halted at Antwerp because the Tournai magazine was not sufficiently stocked to cater for the arrival of these extra troops. And the result of that was they didn't join the army till the 20th of May. So they were delayed by about 2 to 3 weeks. And this is basically a function of seasonality. This is not ineptitude on the part of the Commissariat. It's simply that the commodities are not available. As I mentioned, the troops have arrived between harvest periods. So let's have a look now at transportation issues in a bit more detail. When Brooke Watson went home on Boxing Day in 1793 for his consultations with the Treasury, he had some time to review the performance of the Commissariat during the first campaign. And he got out his slide rule and worked out that hiring 500 wagons, each with 4 horses, was costing about £100,000. However, if he purchased the same and hired the drivers, it came to £81,400. So this led him to put forward a proposal to recruit what became known as the Corps of Royal Waggoners. 3 companies were sent over from Britain, 2 more were raised in Holland, and 2 more were raised in Britain and brought over by Lord Moira in July of 1794. If anyone wants further details on this, I wrote an article in the journal, I think in about 1998, on the Corps of Royal Waggoners. Not content with sorting out the issues with rolling stock, Brooke Watson also organised a contract for draft horses, 1,000 draft horses, 250 to be delivered per week from the 8th of February 1794. He also had a review of watercraft and organised the purchase of 80 billanders. Here is a billander. It's a Dutch craft used on inland waterways. And 40 barges. So they were taken in-house, if you like, as opposed to relying on private contractors. Here is another type of river craft that was widely used called a chute. Please forgive my Dutch pronunciation. These were used for transporting everything, men and materials, sick and wounded soldiers, floating magazines, floating commissariat storehouses, etc. They were used for very widely during the campaign. Right, so at the beginning of 1794, the Duke of York ordered a rearrangement of magazines on the 10th of March, and he stipulated that Antwerp, Tournai and Ypres had to subsist designated numbers of British foreigners' horses for varying lengths of time. Existing magazines at Ghent and Ostend were also to be maintained, and Bruges, the lighter dot there, was to be cleared. Now, major change in 1794, at the beginning of the 1794 campaign, was instead of relying on a network of contractors, there was what I would call a supercontractor appointed, and it was this gentleman, Ernst Jacob Eckart, born in Lower Saxony in 1742. The first contract he was given was actually in September of 1793 for £12 million of oats for delivery to Ostend, Bruges and Newport, basically to cover the British cavalry during winter quarters. There was a second contract for £5 million of oats signed soon after that. All of this was performed satisfactorily. And so in March of 1794, a much larger contract was signed with Eckart for a total of £46.1 million. In other words, 20,600 imperial tons, roughly speaking, of oats, straw, wheat meal, rye meal, and hay, with deliveries to commence on the 17th of March and to be made weekly for 9 weeks. Another contract was signed with him after the expiry of that one. Another one was signed in August of 1794, this time for £41 million, similar commodities. And finally, a contract for 5 months was signed with him in October of 1794. So instead of having a lot of local suppliers, smaller local suppliers, they've gone for one big supplier who has the flexibility for multiple sourcing and multiple delivery to multiple destinations. And his network is European-wide. Now, a brief look at operations in 1794, because this drastically affected the way the Commissariat operated. The campaign started off quite well for the Allies. They captured the fortress of Landrecies on the 30th of April, but then the Allied combined army was defeated at Tourcoing in May, and the Austrian element of it was defeated at Fleurus in June. The French entered Brussels on the 10th of July, and then advanced to the border of the United Provinces by the end of that month. So what we've seen in the second half of 1794 is a marked switch from static operations with fixed magazines to a war of manoeuvre. And as far as the Commissariat was concerned, this meant much more local sourcing, less dependence on transport, and greater reliance on cash. Local suppliers are not going to mess around with bills of exchange at 30 days sight. They want cash right now, otherwise they're not going to supply. Very similar to the sort of situation we would meet today in the commercial world. There was also a much greater reliance on supplies from Britain, because the French had captured the magazine at Ghent in July 1794, and so Brooke Watson wrote to the Treasury, who supplied enough bread for 40,000 men for 4 weeks. They sent a similar volume of biscuit to Helvoetsluis in September, and 2,000 tons of wheatmeal in November. Brooke Watson also, because he couldn't rely on fixed magazines as he had in the first campaign, he made use of floating storage. So by October 1794, he had 3 weeks worth of meal and oats stored on ships out of French reach. In sum, this basically added up to a loss of central commissariat control. Contractors are now delivering, instead of into fixed magazines, they're delivering to individual units, and they're getting what we call bonds, receipts, if you like, from individual units, which they're collecting together, and those are then forwarded to Brooke Watson, and from him back to the British Treasury. So let's conclude by looking at the enraged farmer at Coxheath Camp in 1780, which prompts the question, did the British Army leave behind it a trail of enraged farmers in the Low Countries in 1793 to 5? I would argue no, it didn't. Several reasons for that. Firstly, great care was taken to pay cash for the items supplied. Bonds were issued to local suppliers, and as I said, collected by contractors and then forwarded for payment to the British Treasury. And the bulk of food, the great majority of food, was obtained through contracts with designated suppliers. We can also ask, did the soldiers starve during the campaign? And I would argue again, no, they didn't. There are roughly about 20 eyewitness accounts of the campaign by participants, and very, very few mentions of starvation, apart from the big exception, the retreat into North Germany in January of 1795. So I can quote from Lieutenant Lewis Jones as one example. He served during the campaign in the 57th Regiment, and he stated in mid-November of 1794, but the want of provisions which had been stated in the public prints was a vague report, for at this time they had never been without bread, meat and forage. So finally, to assess the commissariat performance, what I'm trying to show is they were making flexible use of different types of supply contract. They had an awareness of money markets, not only the money markets of different currencies, the florins, the shillings, the louis d'or, but also denominations, silver and gold. There was a lot of attention paid to personnel management. That's something I've not discussed today, but is in the book chapter. So, for example, hiring of local staff who spoke the foreign languages required. There was a lot of advanced planning, things like the laying in the ship's biscuit and using floating storage. Innovation, taking the transportation in-house, and also the introduction of a more formalized bureaucracy. It doesn't affect just the commissariat, but other aspects of the operations of the army at this time. So I think this campaign represents quite an important way station on the way from an 18th century army to what would be more familiar to us today, with a more formalized bureaucracy. It's quite an important part of the British Army's learning curve. Okay, thank you very much. And I will hand you back to Dudley.
Robin, thank you. I found that completely fascinating. We take young soldiers out onto the ground and talk about the realities of war. And by that, most people are thinking about the blood and guts, etc. But actually, what you described this evening are the real realities of war, I believe. Those of us who have worked in a rear headquarters and have had to come to grips with local purchase and contracts, etc., understand that nothing much has changed, etc. But you've laid the foundations there, and there are a couple of questions coming in. But if I may, I'll ask one question. You very usefully described to us the distinction between the Board of Ordnance, the Commissariat, and the Medical Board, and their responsibilities and duties. What I didn't quite understand is why is the Commissariat not responsible for the provision of meat?
I think difficult to store meat. I think it was also a tradition, a sort of modus operandi in the British Army. Reading accounts of the 7 Years' War, for example, regiments had to contract with a supplier of meat, and the meat would usually still be on the hoof and would follow the regiment. It's quite difficult if you're going to herd livestock from, say, a magazine, a central collecting point, for example, to individual units, and keeping it with the unit was presumably regarded as being the most appropriate way to handle it. The bread or the flour or the components to make the bread, on the other hand, or the forage, was generally shipped between the magazine and the unit in wagons or in rivercraft. That would have been slightly more difficult to do in a timely fashion with livestock, and so I think it was simply felt better to keep it with the unit.
Thank you. Gary's asked, what proportion of the actual requirement for the Commissariat was it able to supply during 1793-94?
It's difficult to say because the unit is also involved with a certain amount of its own provisioning. So, for example, Dudley's just mentioned meat. There's also things like vegetables, which the Commissariat didn't supply either. And there are no records that I've found of what individual units were doing to meet their own supply requirements. So, I mean, we're dealing with the 18th century. The records are not complete here. Even things like bills of exchange. I mentioned I've been through 2,800, but there are gaps, and there's nothing after 2nd of July 1794 because the letter books are missing. So we're not dealing with a perfect world, and it is difficult to answer that because simply the information is not available. There would have been also variations in where the unit, a particular unit, was situated. If it had been within French territory, for example, at the beginning of 1793, I think a bit of plundering would have gone on, and that is mentioned in some eyewitness accounts. If it had been in the Austrian Netherlands or the United Provinces or in Allied territory, not such a good idea to plunder the local populace. But there simply aren't the records of what the units procured on their own account.
Thank you. That raises an interesting point for me. Is there any evidence of suppliers switching sides, so to speak, when the French invaded most of the Low Countries?
I haven't found that, but I think by that time the British had alighted upon Herr Eckhart as the main supplier, and he didn't switch sides. probably what did happen, as the French overran the Austrian Netherlands, people down there who had been supplying the British, but possibly were no longer supplying them, probably they were forced or did supply one way or the other. Maybe they didn't have much choice about it. But you know, a lot of this, the French during that advance in the middle part of 1794 reaped quite literally the benefit of the 1794 harvest, which was denied to the Allied armies. So that caused quite a lot of problems, you know, during the back end of 1794.
Another question from Gary: was ammunition supplied entirely separately by the Board of Ordnance?
Yeah, ammunition was so small arms ammunition and for the artillery was solely the responsibility of the Board of Ordnance, and so there was more or less a parallel ordnance structure. They even had their own commissariat as well. They weren't very experienced because Brooke Watson had to step in and bail them out, procuring things like horses and so on for them. But they would have been in charge of making sure there was adequate replenishment of ammunition, and that would have all been done direct with headquarters in the Tower of London.
We seem to have run out of questions at the moment, but I'm curious about your research and where you found most of the information that you've imparted to us this evening. Is it the National Archives? Or?
Yeah. So essentially, there are, as I mentioned during the talk, the Commissariat was a division of the Treasury, and it only existed during wartime. So when war broke out, they scrabbled around to find people to populate the Commissariat, and these were essentially City of London merchants, people like Brooke Watson and his deputy and assistant. The records, therefore, are between those guys, mainly from Brooke Watson, back to the Treasury. So they're contained at the National Archives in the Treasury series, and also the Audit Office series. There are a couple of pieces in the archive at the National Army Museum as well. And so I was looking at letter books. The original letters don't exist. Presumably they were weeded long ago by the powers that be. So what we have left now are letter books where clerks copied in the original correspondence. And I think that the letter book for the second half of 1794, from kind of early July onwards, is missing. And presumably that itself has been weeded or lost or whatever over the years. So we have a reasonably complete picture up to that point. After that, more difficult, but the army is very much in motion. And so the time to sit down and write correspondence, lengthy correspondence, was not really there. And that is also some kind of explanation for why it's lacking too, because there wasn't that much of it. The Treasury letter book back to Brooke Watson is there, but it's just his correspondence with the Treasury is lacking. So that's an issue for somebody like myself trying to piece together what they did. But yeah, this is all material that there was correspondence to and from the Treasury, who I would say were quite proactive, quite amenable. They really trusted Brooke Watson to do a good job, and they left him to do it without interfering. And you know, good sort of management by them, I would say.
Thank you. Before I wrap up this evening and give you our thanks once again, just a word about next month's talk, which is by Luke Reynolds. It's entitled Marching the Balds, the theatrical representation of the army in the 19th century. And I'll just put the link, the registration link. I hope I'm going to be able to put it into, no, I haven't been able to do it. Hold a second. Into the chat box. So that those that are interested could sign up this evening. It will be advertised by the society, I'm certain, but that's the registration link for next month's talk. Robin, it just remains for me to thank you on behalf of the Society, A, for volunteering to do this talk for us this evening, and then for delivering what I believe to be a very fascinating talk.
Thank you very much.
And I look forward to hearing more from you and reading your next book.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening, and hopefully we'll see you next month. Bye-bye.